Ideas of India, where we examine the academic ideas that can propel India forward. My name is Shruti Rajagopalan, and I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Mercator Center at George Mason University. Today, my guest is Sajith, who is a partner at Bloom Ventures, an early-stage Indian venture fund. He's also a well-known writer and the author of the annual Indus Valley Report. We spoke about the trends in the latest Indus Valley Report, the stratifications in Indian consumer markets, investor sentiment, policies and infrastructure to foster the AI boom in India and the AI startup scene, and much more. For a full transcript of this conversation, including helpful links of all the references mentioned, click the link in the show notes or visit mercators.org/podcast. Hi, Sajith. It's such a pleasure. And you're the only guest we've had now for the third time. So thank you for making this part of your, annual Indus Valley report writing and post-mortem. I feel like now I'm in this with you. And this year, before I forget, you were joined again by your co-authors from last year, Anurag Pagaria and Nachimai Savitri, who I believe goes by NS, both of them at Bloom, and also Dhruv Trehan. So, I just want to make sure that this fantastic report that you guys put out every year is acknowledged with all the co-authors. And again, this year, it's absolutely stellar. So congratulations.
Thank you on behalf of the team, and it's a pleasure to be here. Third time, is that right? Wow.
Yeah. And, so one thing I love is it's become a major talking point now, right? So when it first came out, it was literally like a drive link or something that you had put up online, if I remember correctly, on the Bloom website. And now, from people I don't expect, that is, not VCs, not startup founders, people randomly say, oh, that's an India 1 problem instead of a first world problem, right? Or they'll say that's an India 2 trend. And it always makes me smile. And you guys are like officially part of the zeitgeist well beyond the startup culture. Do you get that sense as you do this over, year after year?
I'm beginning to kind of get that now. And this year, I think each year it gets a little more bigger. And I think this year it somehow broke out of tech, Bangalore, tech, Gurgaon, tech, Indus Valley bubble to kind of break out a bit into the mainstream. So this year was exceptionally kind of, I would say, buzzy, and the intensity of it hit us. But yes, increasingly, in fact, I was talking to a VC from a large fund, and he was saying that, hey, people pitch me and say, we are looking at India 1, India 2, and do you invest in India 1, do you invest in India 2? And he says, like, I don't even know what this means, but then I had to read up on it, like, zoo. And at this point, I should clarify that I didn't invent India 1, India 2, India 3. All credit to Mr. Kishore Biani, whose book It Happened in India had it. But we've certainly taken that construct, put data around it, kind of had this metaphor of India 1 as Mexico, and et cetera, right? So we've certainly done a lot to popularize it. It's given these mental frameworks. Certainly, I think this year, I felt like it had kind of hit mainstream India for a bit, right? Yeah, which wasn't so much true last year. Yeah.
No, I think the reason is that a lot of the stuff you're talking about is also like the macro reality we're living in. It has a lot to do with what's going on with India and the US and the capital flows between the two countries, the way investment flows, how we think about, India's sort of growth slump and bouncing back. So you've just made it legible. So as an economist, I'm almost envious. I'm like, yeah, we didn't manage to quite do this. We've been writing these dense reports and, very dense op-ed columns, which people don't quite understand. And I think what you've done very nicely is created a very cool metaphor around it and surrounded it with examples of things we use daily and trends we see daily. And then, people can kind of, even without any knowledge about finance or economics, they're able to grasp what it is you're telling them. So I still think it's quite amazing what you've done.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah.
So, this year's report, it's quite long. You've broken it down into 7 parts. And the first 3 focus on India's growth and structural transformation and sort of consumption patterns, capital formation patterns, things like that. And the next 4 parts of the report are about, general and specific trends in the startup world and everything from seed funding to IPOs to AI and, e-commerce and so on. One thing I observed when I finished reading your report was I felt like there's this winner takes all tendency going on in India. And what I mean by that is, if I had to pick a few examples, like, the seed rounds are fewer but larger in size, right? Second is, for instance, like the top of the pyramid has, in terms of consumption for the India 1 and India 1A, the market has deepened but not widened, right? The income tax collection trends also reflect the same reality, right? So is this just a function of when the growth story slows down a little bit and there's a crunch? There's going to be a winner takes all situation. And in this case, it's going to be that very top of the cream in every market segment and, startup segment that you can identify.
It's interesting that you drew these two parallels. I certainly think over the last few years, I think through the last decade, I think towards the end of that, I think I was very hopeful about India too breaking out, right? Thanks to Geo, for instance, and
Yeah.
UPI. But COVID kind of, I would say, created this K-shaped trend, and it was very harsh on, let's say, India too, and specifically people who have not connected to the digital economy as sharply. And subsequently, given the challenges that we've had a little bit, and now accentuated by geopolitical trends, there is a clear flight to quality happening. Okay, and there's a flight to quality happening in capital flows. I don't know if it's specifically an India only trend because, for instance, a lot of the US stock market growth is led by the seven
Magnificent Seven.
Magnificent Seven. India, of course, has its own Magnificent Seven, but it has its stocks which are really driving, the index upward. And there's certainly a flight to quality in the venture industry as well. There is, for instance, a clear tiering of founders as well, which is not as apparent to folks. Like you would not see it, but to me, there's a clear tiering of founders. You're a first-time founder, and we use this terminology called fluent and fresh. If you're a first-time founder who's not raised capital before, or is not an elite operator from a large unicorn starting up, the way you're going to be valued or the way you're going to be, I won't say treated, you'll be treated well, but you'll start hearing a lot more no's and there'll be a lot more time that you'll have to spend on getting $1 million and it'll be a lot of effort. Whereas somebody else will raise like 5 million over like 3 Zoom meetings or so sometimes over WhatsApp messages. So for instance, there's a hot AI startup which received 25 term sheets apparently, 25 term sheets. Like, so it's the Matthew effect. To he who had more will be given. And that's at play. And I think specifically with respect to consumption and this one, I don't need to belabor the point. Historically, we've had a smaller, like a minority, which we called India one and different terms, etc. for that. So that, I would say it's got a little more accentuated of late. And there are specific reasons for that, we can get into and all that. But I would say, certainly, I think the term I would kind of use, it's clear flight to quality in as far as Indus Valley is concerned. And here I would say it's a little bit more the K-shaped recovery becoming kind of almost becoming set in stone, so to say, to the extent that I feel like at what point will India to make a comeback? We'll have to kind of see.
Yeah, but I also noticed some of the other interesting trends in that, in your earlier reports, and maybe I am misremembering them, or this time, like I just dug into certain nuances a little more. I think you're absolutely right that the Indian market has always tailored itself to the top of the pyramid because that's where most of the consumption expenditure comes from. So they really set the trends. But now there's a further market segmentation in that, this group of people really care about luxury. So now the hope isn't that we'll make this for India 1 and hope that it'll peter down to India 2. It's almost the opposite. It's like, why don't we find that smaller group within India 1 that really cares about luxury, whether it's Banarsi saris or travel or, something else, or even quick commerce. Convenience is an enormous privilege in India.
Yeah.
And then cater towards that without much of an expectation that this market will broaden, because the expectation that it is deep enough and they are rich enough. And this is also true. You have slides on the hotel effect and the Coldplay concerts and so on. So that's where I was going with this. It feels like a little bit different from the old trend of India being consumption driven by its richest folks.
What has happened is past belief that there is a trickle down effect, that you start with India one and then you slowly tailor yourself. And FMCG, for instance, did this really well by they created this playbook by which they would take, so for example, there would be a premium product and they would sachetize it to make it
Exactly.
palatable. And there would always be premium variants. The premiumization was a trend, but there would always be the base variant, and the base variant, the way they made it palatable for consumption was to make it sachetized.
Yeah.
So FMCG, CPG, as it's called in the US, they had their own playbooks, and the challenge for India too has been that the challenge for Indus Valley, I would say, has been that they've not been able to take a similar playbook other than in two, three, four categories. For instance, YouTube, WhatsApp, Flipkart, Paytm, PhonePe. These are all startups which straddle both India 1 and India 2 reasonably successfully.
Yeah.
So
and all network goods. So
all that
we know why, right? It's
yeah,
buried. The answer is buried there. Yeah.
yeah. But beyond this, it's very hard for someone to do both. You could kind of adapt the product significantly to kind of make it palatable for India too, and that means you have to fundamentally change the nature of the product itself, right? And that means that the adjustments that you do, it's not just sachetization where you take a smaller variant, etc. It's not a pack size issue. It's a fundamentally change the product formulation issue.
Yeah.
So the playbooks that historically FMCG and big Indian consumer brands kind of use successfully to trickle down into India too are not available for Indus Valley to kind of necessarily adopt. So what Indus Valley has really done is to break it up into two parts. Say that, hey, we'll look at India too, and there are a few of us who look at India too, or like typically regional kind of variations or regional flavors of India too, and try and do something there. Okay, or there are folks saying I'll focus on India one, and instead of trickling down, they're saying we will use India one as a springboard to see if we can launch into the US or Western market. That playbook is something that's becoming more and more clear now, and we're beginning to see brands which are successfully doing that. Like, for instance, there's a company called Skillmatics in the toys business, there's Pocket FM, and they're not necessarily selling only to the Indian diaspora. They're selling to Americans, regular American
Yep.
Joes and Janes, right?
Yeah.
So that
They're selling to an income group, basically. And that income group largely resides in the Western world, and a small fraction of it resides in India.
correct. So this is sort of what we call the India as a 51st state of the US playbook.
Yeah. I
And
love that tweet that you had put up.
Yeah.
I love the tweets you've collected in the report. Sorry, that's a random aside, but it's so much fun to read this report.
Yeah. I'll kind of give a secret away. The tweets help make it fun, right? But there's also like a interesting growth hack built into it. If I put a tweet and if someone has, I'm not necessarily saying every tweet is selected by looking at the follower count, but if someone has a reasonable follower count and they're likely to tweet about that page and there's a curiosity. So that is another way in which we kind of bake distribution into the product itself. So I won't say there's a huge nefarious intent to select only popular tweets, but both help. The tweets help make it palatable. There's also a great distribution hack.
No, and it's fun to read because, folks like you and I, we sort of live our life online. So we see this as it comes and goes. And then suddenly when you see it in a report in a particular context, you have that like little aha moment go off in your head. Now, the trend that you described, there are 2-3 different ways of interpreting that trend. One way of interpreting that trend is just, hey, we've gotten better at segmenting our markets. And the fact that everyone has a smartphone and the fact that we can target so precisely, whether it's in advertising or whether it is in, use or UI UX, we've just gotten better at that. And this is a great step forward for the Indus Valley. That's one way of interpreting it. Another way of interpreting it is founders and investors have kind of given up on the India growth story. in some sense, right? And now it's a question of, hey, what do we understand and which market can we kind of really cater to and do it at service levels that are good enough that we kind of dominate that particular market. Or it could be something that, you and I have written about before, which is this kind of elitism that, the people who are making these products really don't know India too, and they don't know Bharat, and they haven't stepped outside of a Coldplay concert. So they are now catering to what they know, and that's just the problem of the tiny echo chamber, which I don't think is the case. I think Indus Valley is pretty deep and quite diverse. So of the three, what do you think is driving this particular trend?
I do feel that there is a little bit of truth to all the three aspects, but I would say that I think it's not that the founders feel that the India growth story doesn't exist. I think they've gotten smarter at knowing that because once you take venture money is built around there's a certain speed and cadence to it, which is that the money that's given is typically given 18, 24 months at a time, right? So the money that you get is to help you conduct experiments to hit a certain rate of growth in 18 months, at which some other VC will come. So the next stage VC will come and take it ahead.
Yeah, it's all exit.
Correct. So it's not like this VC exits, but this VC doesn't lead that round. The next VC has to come and underwrite that round and they may participate a little bit. But because of the 18, 24-month cadence that you have to grow very fast with a certain milestone, you work backwards to say, what do I need to do to kind of demonstrably hit? And over time, I think there's a clear realization that there is reasonable depth in certain markets, and there's certainly what you need to do. So the playbooks are clear. You start in Bangalore, sometimes you start in Gurgaon. You at least hit one more city, and if you've done two cities, then it's very clear that you will be able to get the next round. I mean, and you have to demonstrate product market fit, growth, retention, some unit economics, etc. Those matter too. But sort of the playbooks are getting clearer. And I think what's happened over the past few years is that the playbooks for how you kind of demonstrate to each subsequent investor. So those have got kind of clearer. Like there's a clear playbook and there's clear awareness of that playbook. Similarly, there's a SaaS playbook for how you kind of expand into the US, etc. So I would say what's happened is it's not that the Indian founder feels that there's no growth story. I think they fundamentally tend to believe that there is a market. For example, some of the founders are actually surprised by, for example, how UPI autopay or UPI enables microtransactions or, subscriptions to kind of happen at like at rapid pace. So it, so they are pleasantly surprised, but just that I think the playbooks have got clearer and now they are performing according to those playbooks.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, it's they're saying I need to get to a certain depth in a certain market, and I'm going to give up everything else and kind of perform according to the playbook. I think that's what is driving fundamentally. Yes, there are perhaps a small minority of folks who probably say that, hey, this is what I know. I'm going to create this avocado brand, which is like organic vegan something, like slipper brand. Like there will be these niches for sure. But I think increasingly the people who are coming into startup founders are very educated. They've read the YC posts, they've read articles, etc. So I think it's more around the playbooks getting very clear and very structured now. And performing to that.
And also they're like usually pitching on potential, right? Which means to communicate to potential investors, they need to signal which playbook they are part of. So that could also be part of this, right? I mean, the Indus Valley is so diverse and thriving, you still need a shorthand to communicate.
Yeah.
And this might be one of the things driving it. But maybe in the future, they will also create UI UX models that can broaden the brand, or at least so I hope. I hope these things don't get limited to a market size that will, cap off at 20 million.
Yeah. So I don't think it's, I mean, I'm hopeful that it'll expand beyond 20 million. And what happens is it can expand, but the energy and the effort required kind of to push it beyond makes the business less capital efficient. Then pricing becomes an issue. So you have to change pricing significantly to make it more palatable to India too, because you can't sachetize like experience or offering. And then what happens is then you need to work backwards to figure out, hey, how do I kind of reduce, like how do I reduce my cost base? And one very interesting trend, and I remember speaking with, I think it was a journalist at the Arc, who said something very interesting. He said, we're talking about interesting patterns that we're seeing. And I think it was Madhav at the Arc, who said that the new wave of startups, for instance, like Rapido, okay? Rapido is now actually the number two mobility player and
Wow.
the close number two after Uber. Historically, India mobility used to be a duopoly between Uber and Ola. Now
Hola.
Rapido has come in and become the number two. And Rapido's cost base is very different. It's much lower than, for instance, Ola. And so I think it comes down to the following that Ola fundamentally said, hey, this works in the West. Let me just try and replicate it.
Yeah.
They tried to build a lot of things which are probably not required.
Yeah.
Maybe they had more product managers. The way they thought was very different. Whereas today, for instance, there's a lot of custom code you can build. There's a way in which they've architected the company and the product to really serve what maybe more and more India too needs.
Yeah.
Like, for example, Rapido started out as a two-wheeler. They
Yeah.
didn't start out as a car. They started out as
Yeah.
a two-wheeler, right? And so the way in which now they've started cars too, the way in which they've kind of architected the company
Yeah.
is at a much lower cost rates.
Yeah.
But I feel it's much harder to do it if you start from India one because you can, but if you start from the notion that hey, I need to kind of serve the mass customer. For example, Misho, which is really
Yeah.
it could become very large. They're fundamentally an India two brand and cheap clothes and Rapido is another. And that's also leading to very interesting models like Namayatri, which is coming and saying,
Yeah.
stuff, I'll actually charge the driver and make it a like
Yeah.
a SaaS product. So I'm hopeful that it will not stop at 20 million, that it will grow and that we'll start seeing like like founders re-architecting models or kind of rethinking how to deliver. Not all will do, but we're going to see some brands which are not able to adapt and which kind of throw money at it, and they'll be less capital efficient to reach more and more people beyond the charm 20, 30 million, 40 million set. But there'll also be founders who are smart about it and kind of like Rapido is a great example
Yeah.
who kind of look at it from a very fundamental point of view. I've given examples of Friend, for instance, that they're not trying to solve the dating problem so much as the conversation
Yeah.
problem. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm hopeful, but we'll see. Yeah.
Actually, Rapido is a great example because, the way, like if we had this, when we had this conversation 2 years ago, right? Our thinking was that Rapido will start like Ola, which is, people building, the Uber for India, DoorDash for India kind of thing. When we had this conversation last year, it was like there will be a premium and a freemium, right? There will be a regular and a sachet. And now it's, I think, almost the reverse, which is if you create this Namayatri for autos or, for scooters, which is Rapido, there are rich people whose children need to take an auto to go to school, right? Or who need some kind of pooling situation to go to school. Now, eventually those parents, or those nannies will also figure out that this is something we can use. And eventually, I think they will have product segments which offer an air-conditioned car version as opposed to a non-air-conditioned, regular cab version and so on and so forth. And that seems to be a very nice and organic way of growing or at least connecting India 1 and India 2, which is we need to get the lessons from the ground up as opposed to from the top down, which of course you can imagine how much that appeals to my Hayekian sensibility. But it just seems like this is not so much an India problem as much as it's just a more sophisticated and nuanced entrepreneurship story that's playing out.
I agree with you. And in fact, Rapido has actually done what you suggested. They've actually got cars now, AC cars. They're not necessarily as clean, but then Uber is not as clean either.
I'm a consumer, right? I am very much that Indian lady who will take an auto when it's crowded and who needs a car in the evening or when it's too hot.
Yeah. So it is happening. Yeah.
So this part I find super impressive. And some of this growth of things like Namayatri was literally partly like government, initiated. But a lot of this has happened because of the DPI infrastructure, right?
Yeah.
In your past reports, you had set up the DPI point quite differently, right? You had set it up as this digital public infrastructure upon which startups are now building. this time you've set it up more as this is digital public welfare.
Yeah.
Right? And it is really driving the consumption end and the borrowing end, small ticket borrowing end, which will of course have some impact on how startups, deal their business and target their customers and so on. But this I thought was a marked difference from last few years' reports. So how did you arrive at that, or was this always simmering in the background?
Yeah, it was kind of simmering in the background. So last year's, I think, focus was different. I think we wanted to kind of talk a little bit more about the DPI tech and how they were actually leading to innovative business models or supporting business models. For instance, Namayat we just started. It's built on the Beacon protocol, which is an open source protocol. UPI Autopay was very interesting. For instance, ONDC credit, I think it just pilots is starting last year. Now it's kind of a little bit more established. The account aggregator model as kind of was gathering steam last year. So we wanted to kind of talk about those aspects and showcase some of how they were supporting startup models. And I think this year we wanted to specifically go a little deeper, but as with we couldn't invest energies into everything. But one aspect that stood out is how much DPI has led to, we call it digital welfare state. I think that's like a term I like to kind of use. How significant direct transfers have become to kind of keeping, there is electoral strategy behind it, we won't deny it. But it's also, for instance, it's like India doesn't have social security. And now what we're seeing with these largely all these schemes that are there for women, for pregnant women in Delhi and so on and so forth. There's just 2 trillion of transfers going every year, like you say. So what we're really seeing is this digital welfare aspect, which I think we wanted to just highlight it. And because a lot of people who read the report, etc., are India One people, they don't even know that this is happening. They don't give attention to this. So we want to kind of bring that out a little bit. And I think the second was to really look at why certain technologies have yet to find their feet, why they haven't taken off yet. And there, I don't think we're able to do the kind of definitive research to go deeper. And there were also space issues and etc. But it's certainly something we want to explore because not everything the government launches is necessary. I mean, it is not going to work. Like end of the day, they're trying out very different things. But certainly, for instance, this ABA, which is Ayushman Bharat Health, like that is beginning to give impact, and that's something we'll look at next year. But already when I talk to kind of like founders in the healthcare space, one very interesting trend is that there's a startup we were talking to, and they were actually selling used medical equipment, which suddenly has been stopped now, and they're figuring out what next. One of the interesting things he said was doctors, like typically who would want value products, today know that they're likely to get insurance that is going to come. So there's a preference for more premium brands like a Philips over even a Samsung. And sort of, I found it very interesting that how insurance, for instance, is beginning to drive that behavior. And ABBA is very interesting, and we're probably going to kind of dig deeper into that a little bit over these months. And OEPC credit is another interesting thing. That's something we're going to dig a little more deeper into. I'm not as excited for some reason as much as with the ONDC marketplace e-commerce thing. But ONDC logistics and ONDC credit seem intrinsically interesting. So there are aspects I really want to kind of go into and look deeper. And there's also the fact that the government is one of the big consumers of AI now. Like, so what is the big product like, and why isn't there like at what point when the government launch query if there's a scheme you can take advantage of, and you can use a voice bot or like an agent to kind of get that thing delivered to you. Like at what point does it happen? So very excited by all of this, but it's something where we've not been able to give it as much time, which is why I think I kind of reflects all those compromises.
No, I didn't think of it as a compromise. Maybe, I already read this in because when I look at something like NSS data, for instance, because I see that end of the spectrum also, right? I see how much families get stressed because of one health emergency.
Yeah.
Right? So most families in India borrow from, friends and family, and then they have these small ticket loans that go in. And
Yeah.
that's just one health emergency, right? And it could be something fairly minor. Like, I'm not saying this is like, kidney dialysis or chemotherapy, which will go on for months and years. This could be like one simple surgery. That's it. And it fits in very nicely with the consumption story you've pointed out, which is that actually India is just almost entirely consumption driven.
Yeah.
And the most troubling trend in India too is how much of that consumption is also, sort of fueled by borrowing.
Yeah.
In a way that their investments is not fueled by borrowing, or their, human capital or physical capital investment. So I think this is, you're absolutely right, but this welfare piece is part of it somewhere,
Yeah.
right? Would it be different, as most economists suggest, if you just did like a direct cash transfer, like, roll up everything into one instead of targeting individual vote banks? Give a direct cash transfer and you're done? Or should all these central schemes exist in the first place, or something else? Because I don't think, I'm about as libertarian as they come, but no one, including me, suggests that 1 billion people should, starve and live without rations, right? So there is some element of the welfare state which needs to be involved in making sure that the gains from the marketplace are spread out a little bit more evenly. But yeah, I think that would be, now I'm already looking forward to next year's report since you mentioned all this.
Yeah. It's not like other people haven't spoken about it. The more direct cash transfers you give and where customer decides where to spend it, you could do that with farmers, for instance, instead of giving subsidies which have other challenges.
Yeah.
Certainly, I think that would be a better approach. And what the government has is like, and it's complex now. That states which have certain schemes are linked to certain things, etc. So I think that I haven't done the exact calculation, but I think there is kind transfers and there is this cash transfers as well.
Yeah.
And certainly, I think I don't have the exact data, so I definitely don't want to kind of say anything. But
No one does.
yeah. Yeah.
No one has a list of all the schemes. We've tried looking.
Yeah. There's an interesting startup called Hak Darshak, which does this and tries to list all the schemes that are possible. And at some point, I think that will become like a AI bot. I think,
That
it
would
should
be
become.
awesome.
Yeah. They've tried to kind of list all the schemes that if you are, for instance, someone who belongs to this caste in this taluka, is a farmer, like below like do biga, whatever the mean,
Yeah.
what do you get? So yeah, but you're right. Yeah.
I want to get into the AI part of the story. That's been one huge development this year, right? So last year, when things were picking up and OpenAI and Anthropic and all the big American firms were releasing their models, the wisdom, and I really mean wisdom coming from Bangalore, right? This is everyone from Nandan downwards, was we need to layer applications on top of these.
Yeah.
And there is no need for us to join this crazy rat race and spend, $100 billion in building out foundational models. And India has access to English, as well as India is open, unlike the Chinese firewall and all these other problems. So India is sort of very well poised to take advantage of this. Now, the DeepSeek story just completely demolished this idea, and India's sort of, the tech people have gone into tailspin now trying to pitch this. The government has gone into tailspin trying to invite people to build AI models, as if you can invite someone to build this out. Like, this is not Lego blocks. So, one, how do you perceive what has happened? And then we can get into how you view, AI both in foundational models as well as eating up SaaS or, all the other downstream consequences of AI becoming larger and larger share of this space.
Yeah. I would say that DeepSeek, there is pre-DeepSeek and post-DeepSeek, certainly, as you said, and a lot of the shift in thinking has certainly been led by that. There's also a term around AI sovereignty, which has come together that, it's sort of like having, and there's a presentation by this gentleman called Paras Chopra, who's the oldest company. And he's trying to build a foundation model. He's a very smart young man. And he had this presentation which I saw and which talked about how each power, right? And India, like as a power, should have its own model. It's sort of like how nuclear, having nuclear weapons
Exactly.
deterrence, right? And that's sort of the analogy we use for AI. It is interesting, and I kind of get it from today's world where suddenly this geopolitics matters suddenly, right?
Yeah.
And for a long time it didn't seem to matter. Globalization is dead. I don't know, but in this world, and certainly I think the government wants its model. Some of it is to do with, I want to use my words very carefully, but there is certainly an element of tech nationalism, tech chauvinism. I don't know if chauvinism is the right word, but
Tech
well,
sovereignty.
tech sovereignty. Yeah. So that
Yeah.
we should have our models. Why should
Yeah.
we not have our models?
Yeah.
We should send people into space. Look, I feel that Land Pritchett used to say, right, and then post that, like for instance, that the difference between India and Indonesia was that Indonesia educated, like focused on schools where India focused on colleges. I don't know if he said it, but certainly there was this article that came out which looked at India versus China as well.
Yeah.
So I would say, I think, but for a country which has got $2,700 per capita income, how much should you focus on some of these, right? And is it really as big an issue as it's made to be? Does AI sovereignty really matter? Well, I think we passed that argument now. Now people want that, right? And the government's getting 18,000 GPUs organized,
Yeah.
which I don't know if Brazil has organized that. I don't, like, equivalent countries, I don't know if Indonesia has organized it, but we've organized it, right? And we kind of calling for almost like a tender, right? For people to kind of create. So I think there's just too much activation energy now that's happened, and it is sort of it's like a snowball rolling downhill. You will get a model. Will it be a incredibly powerful model like DeepSeek? I don't know. Okay,
I can say it won't be.
but we'll get something which we can put the label that, hey, this is our model, and I think there may be more than one model, two models, but I think what you're probably and it'll be an English model most likely because it's so hard to get those number of parameters and data collected for an Indian language,
Yeah.
right? You've got, like, I don't you if you want to do something like that in Gujarati or Oriya or something, you need to scan so many documents. I mean, there just isn't enough data. Like for instance, 2000, like 7, 8, 18, 19, OpenAI onwards, OpenAI has been hoarding up data. And that's what got Scale AI's growth, Turing's growth, a lot of Indian, like small companies like benefiting from that wave. So, but to really create like a powerful vernacular model, you got to hoard up and put structure a lot of data, which it doesn't exist. I feel like, and hence what you're going to do is you're going to create an English model, but yes, it will be your model, and we probably should be proud of it. But I would say my this one is that I don't believe Nandan was fundamentally right. He wasn't wrong, right? And I think there's a lot of truth to what he said that we need to focus on the applications. And on application side, we haven't seen as much. There are a few examples, of course, like I mentioned in video, for instance, which is like 60, 70 million ARR, sells globally. There's another smaller example of presentations AI, but where are they? And for instance, like why isn't an option for people to kind of, like for instance, give feedback to their MLA, for instance,
Yeah.
like why isn't there a way in which the government can, like, call people up? I mean, there's so many interesting ideas,
Yeah.
and I feel like those need to get focus as well. So fundamentally, I'm actually a little bit more in the Nandan camp, really.
Yeah.
But that said, look, end of the day, I'm also excited by shiny new things. I mean, part of the reason why you're in venture is to see cool new toys and all of these things coming out. So that excites me a little bit as well. But yeah, so I do feel that we will get something, but what we'll get, you made your point. But yeah, we'll have to be seen.
The way I see this foundational model question is not that India can't build it,
Yeah.
but in India, we have this sort of, I call it the upside down Indian state, where the Indian state refuses to build public goods and wants to build all this private infrastructure, right? So we won't build to pick up your garbage and, get your roads in order and things like that. But we're going to give you LPG gas and fertilizer subsidy. And now it gets worse. Now, to me, this AI model is the most Marie Antoinette version of that, right? They could have very easily said, why, the Modi government already has this fantastic digitization project,
Yeah.
which is enormously beneficial, not just to the state, but it is beneficial to the private sector, it is beneficial to citizens. Why not, instead of spending on these GPUs, throw that money into digitization, make it go into hyperdrive, knowing full well that if the data are there, then it's going to effectively subsidize the cost for some entrepreneur who can get everything else figured out. And private capital can pay for the GPUs. It's doing it the world over. Nowhere else in the world does the government have to buy GPUs. For DeepSeek, also the Chinese government didn't buy the GPUs.
Absolutely.
Maybe they helped them steal the chips is about as far as the conjecture goes on the Chinese government involvement. Like, looking the other way, and maybe they're like understating the extent of the chips they used. But I don't see any other government doing this crazy Marie Antoinette thing. And it is a kind of, you're absolutely right. Even our PLI schemes, we don't target our PLI schemes towards apparel and leather shoes and shoelaces and things like that. They're targeted towards semiconductor chips. It's like you're solving this very specific problem where, in a bizarre way, you almost have sort of the least comparative advantage, but it's because your minister or whoever wants to look cool at Davos. Like, I don't even understand the incentives at play. Maybe it's that same, the piece that you wrote about, like, Indians sort of living in the Anglosphere and, sort of living in India, but their mind is abroad in the first world. It almost seems like this elitist, weird thing. So that's kind of where I am. Not to say that I'm, pessimistic, but the second part is, the government's also done this for ISRO, right? But what we always miss is, for a Mars mission to happen today, you have to have ISRO for 50 years, and you have to have incubation, and you have to have like this kind of intergenerational incubation that takes place where you have like a deep bench of scientists. Where do we have that for AI? Right? Where is that, Stanford, Berkeley, Caltech, Oxford, Cambridge merged in with the private sector and the data that you then finally get something like this going? So these are the sorts of things that make me, snark aside, extremely confused about what is it that we're approaching from a policy perspective, and why would we ever, approach this problem in this specific way? There are lots of... Another reason AI models don't take off in India is we punish scale, right? You can't build a large captive power plant. Electricity tariff pricing is all over the place. These are the two most important things you need for a data center, right? Or to have your GPUs up and running. Our tariffs have crazy amount of policy uncertainty. So what chips you import and where you import them from, and will the, GPU tariffs change over a period of... Nothing we know. So we could do, the government has a massive role to play, but calling for tenders as if they're building a highway, and I'm just baffled by this, Sajith. I'm sorry. I know that you don't have to comment on this. This can be my rant alone, but the whole thing is just baffling to me.
Indeed it is. And the article that you wrote, the paper that you wrote with Alex, which is premature imitation, I like to use that lens because India has different interest groups, and there is certainly an interest group. Let's call it, for instance, bureaucrat, whatever, right? And the government, right? So the government bureaucracy, and there's certainly a desire to. You mentioned about standing out in Davos, etc. There is certainly an India one aspect, and it's incredible. Like the fact that with $2,700 per capita income, we've been able to do a Chandrayaan. It's incredible. Like I find these, it's utterly fascinating. For instance, at some point we decided that, hey, it's fine to kind of create like get a nuclear weapon. Look, all of this, was finally, I respect the decisions that led to that, etc. I'm not saying, but you kind of took all of these decisions, and fundamentally, I think we've not been able to get like a lot of people into the four, five, $6,000 per capita income, and I find that utterly fascinating. And for sort of each interest group comes and says, "Hey, look, I want to kind of do my version of premature annotation,"
Yeah.
and that is sort of what is really I think happening, and where you're coming and saying, we are as good as Silicon Valley. We are cool. Like let's build our thing. And yeah, sure, we are very good engineers, but I think those the challenge is that we don't have the density of
Yeah.
engineers. Yeah, which is
Or
a
the
challenge.
ecosystem, you need research labs and you need
Yeah,
people who are just mathematicians and
yeah,
just biologists. So,
yeah,
again, I'm not dissing Indian talent at all. I think the talent is there in spades.
yeah,
I think it's just the infrastructure around it. So, DRDO had that infrastructure built around for decades on end. And then you get very Indianized version of a nuclear test and so on, right? ISRO. And
yeah,
again, Chandrayaan, I would not compare to this AI thing, to be honest, because it was done at a fraction of the cost.
yeah,
And that's not the direction in which the current GPU AI foundational model is going. No one is saying we need to build this the Indian way at very low cost. The thing is, of course, we can spend the money. We
yeah,
are a superpower. Like it's almost the opposite of the ISRO Chandrayaan thing that, folks like you and I admire that, we can punch well above our weight because Indian scientists in an Indian infrastructure or ecosystem are able to solve the problem very differently from how someone else would do it in Sweden or Norway. It's the opposite of premature imitation, right? It's really ground up.
yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, so now that the foundational thing is out of the way, and sorry for ranting, how do you think about the AI startup scene? Right? So one view is any new cool AI startup that was coming around with all these wrappers and they were getting eaten up by ChatGPT the next
Yeah.
week. Like someone would introduce something and they would just get outcompeted. On the other hand, there's the feeling that, hey, Perplexity is the outlier, right? Like, look at how it's managed to challenge both ChatGPT search and Google and things like that. So, one is, where are you on that debate of, segmentation and very targeted specific AI startups? Or is there something about the nature of AI and compute which just makes that very difficult and makes this very different from SaaS style, product differentiation and very niche startups for niche consumer groups?
Um, Fundamentally, I think all startups, whether it's SaaS, AI, etc., are trying to solve consumer problems, and ideally consumer problems that are faced by large numbers of people, because that's how you kind of create, like, build a very large startup. Um, and I would say that we're increasingly in a world where there will of course be foundational models fight amongst each other, but I think uh, beyond a point, unless you're going to kind of use it for, I don't know what, protein folding calculations or something. I think, like, maybe there'll be a model which is like Tyler was saying that Gemini is well suited for legal stuff, right? I haven't read see podcast yet, but it's reserved for next week. But I kind of saw that is I think his interview with David Perel,
Yeah.
and for instance, so there'll be something for like doing mathematical equations, or there'll be some model that's better suited for that, etc. So, but other than that, I think the broad layer, I think all of them are the same. And I think really, I think the earlier this joke used to be that, hey, like you're a wrapper company, you'll get eaten up. But I think you can really create interesting differentiation. And I would say Perplexity is a great example. Granola, for instance, is less known,
Oh,
but
yeah.
yeah, that's an interesting example. The founder is a very sharp guy, and I really find this, like there's an article he wrote as well as his podcast as well, very interesting. So I would say I would say that ultimately you're limited by, AI is going at one level is going to be like electricity, right? So in the 1920s you had General Electric, so you'll have open AI, but in a few years you'll be down to who takes advantage of electricity better, right? And who takes advantage of AI for solving a real issue. So someone will say, I use electricity to manufacture something which is, so which is like maybe Pepsi, because and my factories run on electricity.
Yeah.
So I like that metaphor, and increasingly I find myself trying to read a little bit about how electricity evolved, the early days of electricity. You kind of see parallels there.
Yeah.
And I would say that I'm a little disappointed in India that and why do we only have one individual, like for instance, like which is the startup that like helps you create like videos by through
Yeah.
prompts, and of course it's built on OpenAI and is one of OpenAI's biggest customers, etc. So why aren't more Indian startups kind of using that? And that's a pity. And there could be the startup that is funded by some of my peers, which I don't know about, and which is kind of going to launch and become big. But when I speak to some of my peers, they do say that they're not necessarily finding as much in India. A lot of them are investing abroad in the US.
Yeah.
So the other wave that's happened is Indian VCs are setting up teams in the US to fund, and they are actually funding Indian founders, sometimes non-Indian founders, who are building in that space in the US. So we ourselves came close to doing one such thing. I find that fascinating.
So, what is the reason for that? Is the constraint talent? Is the constraint capital? Is it the ecosystem or the customer?
Talent,
Okay, yeah,
talent.
that's the constraint.
It's fundamentally talent. And I think density matters, right?
Yeah,
And I remember this fascinating Charles Correa article a long time back. Strange to bring Charles Correa into this, but it sort of stayed in my head of cities. You talk about cities and this. So you have when weird people meet and suddenly more like a different kind of weird person emerges, right?
yeah,
And sort of like bad to kind of bring it in, can't explain it. But I remember seeing those images of difference between villages and cities is cities are more spiky people. And when
yeah,
more and more of those spiky people meet, unusual geniuses emerge. And so
yeah,
what's happening, I think, is we just don't have enough talent density even in Bangalore. Maybe it's there. I don't sorry, but I don't feel there's enough talent density. And there was a fascinating chart we actually checked that 7% of top AI researchers are Indian. Not my comment, but
yeah,
none work in India.
yeah,
So I feel like that is one key factor.
yeah,
Because once you build, and if it's cool enough, customers will get created,
yeah,
and customers will kind of figure out all my dollars are going to non-Indian companies. All my AI dollars, whatever I spent, like
yeah,
50, $60 a month on all your different tools, are going to like non-Indian companies. So
yeah,
what is stopping us? I think it's fundamentally talent density. You need a
yeah.
certain amount of talent density in one place for a lot of ideas to be riffed and discussed, and then suddenly
Yeah.
something emerges. Yeah, it
Yeah.
didn't lack that.
It's funny you say this. I've been an economist for a long time, but the older I get, now what you described is exactly what we called endogenous growth theory in economics, right? Paul
Okay.
Romer came up with it and he won the Nobel Prize for it and so on. And that's exactly this cluster effect that you're talking about, right? That where you have this talent density and this density of ideas. And one thing I realize over and over again is just how difficult it is to create these clusters. Some of these cities have been there for millennia, and that's where people end up going, right? And the big hope in India was following China that as India gets richer and urbanizes more, we'll create these huge pockets of talent density. And China has somehow managed to do it, right?
Yeah.
Maybe, as you rightly point out in your report, it's because they focused on primary education. They spent so much on R&D. They launched 100 universities for every one university India launched, through the public sector and so on. But that has been one enormous disappointment for me, that somehow we don't get that, we don't understand how growth really takes off,
Yeah.
right? And to the extent that both human capital matched with the right physical capital, all of it being in a dense place and all of it being relatively, in a free and liberal environment without the threat of uncertainty and expropriation. That well established truth, like, one, it keeps coming back when I read the paper over and over again. And again, like, semiconductors also happened in Silicon Valley. That's how it gets its name. The internet boom also happened there. And now the AI boom is also happening there. Isn't that like really weird and bizarre? Like,
Yeah, that's it. I say that in the case of China, the path dependence, or I don't know what to call it, but the second order effect, really, not path dependence, but second order effect of Xi Jinping's crackdown. on finance and tech was what led to DeepSeek. Because
Yeah.
suddenly that company was told you're making too much money from the wrong things, and they said, okay, we'll pivot. And because it was a tech company trying to eke out nanoseconds of time to get
Yeah.
a trading advantage, they were
Yeah.
very good at kind of managing GPU and eking out some advantage from GPU, and which has actually been DeepSeek's strength because they
Yeah.
focused on how to kind of connect and kind of anyway. So I would say that I think we need to kind of say that, like, I think in a way, China got a bit lucky. I don't think Xi Jinping, or maybe this is what Xi Jinping anticipated. If so, it's brilliant, right?
No,
But
no, no. This was
yeah,
just someone else did it, and now the government will take credit for it, I think.
absolutely.
And
Yeah,
I appreciate that. I think that I love that kind of political opportunism.
yeah, yeah. So we've kind of done a little bit of reading. Some of that didn't come through. But my colleague Natsamai, who
Yeah.
worked on the report, she had actually read a couple of Substacks, and there was this, I forget the name of the body, etc. But it was an Australian body which actually looked at what 50 or 60 different sub technologies in AI, and they found how papers from China were consistently, and people used to say, "Oh, they just create it's like a paper mill, right? Like
Yeah.
they just publish papers." And but they were also better at getting better and better in quality.
Yeah.
So I think what happened is China systematically improved over the last few years. Now, some of it is to do with the fact that the Indian state, like I mean, we encourage immigration, and it's very easy for like a very elite like Indian math, computer science guy to really migrate to the US, etc. And we're okay with that. Whereas China, for example, maybe it's a little more harder, maybe, and there's a lot more numbers, so there's a lot more density there. Oh, I mean, some of them go, but some of them stay back. So I think it's just these I think these numbers and these things just worked out much better in China's favor, and they haven't worked out in India. Because what happens is if you're going to send the top 100 folks from, like let's say top 100 folks who crack J, and let's say probably many of them will do very well in the maths Olympiad or the physics
Yeah. Yeah.
Olympiad, etc. So top 100, top 200. But typically, and this is what research says, 60, 70, 80% of them today just land up in
Yeah.
the US, right?
Yeah. I think
And
Didi did a
they
whole
did that.
thread on this, right? Yeah. I
Right.
remember reading that.
Yeah, that's right. Didi is the guy who did that, and Didi Das, and so I think that is really one aspect that at some point, if India wants to retain, like if, for example, try and create like an institute, like an institute of like an IAS, which is the Institute of Advanced Study Equivalent, like TIFR. TIFR should just say, if you're top 100, don't go. Like, come do what you want here, and try and create like what you call a cluster effect, right? Where they all gather together, something special could come.
Yep.
But it will take time. It won't happen like tomorrow, but it will happen in a few years.
No, I'm also optimistic about that sort of thing. I'll tell you what I'm pessimistic about. For the China density to happen, across the country and also in like individual sectors, we have to fundamentally change the Indian mindset and get out of misallocation of capital. Like most of our engineers are engineers because that's a sort of ticket to a better life, not because they want to do engineering, right? Everyone wants a government job because that's a ticket to a stable life, not because they
Right.
actually want to work in government or be a PWD engineer or anything like that. We end up in civil engineering because you got a lower rank, and we end up in computer engineering because you got a higher rank, and not because you're actually interested in that. So
Correct.
we are using demand, and instead of the price system or some other system, we are using rankings as the allocating mechanism, which
Yeah.
ends up fundamentally misallocating talent. And once you're in chemical engineering, then 4 years, please hang out in chemical engineering. That's it. So we get people who are very smart. We're able to signal they're very smart because we took in the right lot. They haven't learnt that much over the 4 years. Of course, that depends on who they are. And at the end of the day, they're utterly useless for being an actual chemical engineer,
Yeah.
right? So that, I think, that's a social problem which we need to solve at some fundamental level, where the parents stop telling kids in fifth standard that they need to become an engineer or a doctor or crack JEE. I mean, if I meet one more doctor who has become an actor, really,
Yeah.
just such a ghastly, waste of social resources to do this. Every single one of those TVF, they make these amazing sketches and now
Yeah.
Netflix shows and all, right? They're all engineers. Why in God's name do you need to be an engineer to write? a sketch. So this is the sort of misallocation that just happens along, I mean, way beyond TIFR and ISC and IIT. I mean, I don't want to just blame them. So I think that human capital, problem which you've pointed out also in the report, I'm very pessimistic about this, yeah, Sajid. In fact, I'm more optimistic about the startup situation
Yeah,
because I think it gives a lot of people exit. People drop out of college or, their startups alongside college and actually start allocating their human capital in the place that really matters. So I
yeah,
feel like the Indus Valley has given one potential exit route,
yeah,
which is both very respectable, can make money, and allocate, human capital well. But we need like 7,000 more for the size of the country,
yeah.
which is not very comforting.
True, true, very true. Yeah, interesting way to put it on, yeah, on that fact that there's no price mechanism that regulates talent allocation, but it's a strange ranking mechanism. And yeah,
Yeah, and you have like people my age who put their JE rank in their CV.
yeah,
It's an embarrassment. I mean, if
yeah,
I still put my 12th standard board marks on my CV, I'd want to shoot myself. Like, it
yeah,
just means the last, I don't know, 20 years have been a total waste.
yeah,
Right? But that's just, it's a funky thing. And I don't want to blame them individually or, ridicule them. There's obviously a reason for this system, but I see this on LinkedIn all the time. Like, people put their JE rank
yeah,
way beyond the years of
yeah,
JE. Now, a couple of other trends, I quickly wanted to pick your
yeah.
mind on. One very cool thing that you pointed out is, the increase in gold,
Mm,
right? So, so gold has historically been a hedge against inflation in high inflation economies. And in
yeah,
India, there's that gold obsession.
yeah,
We started getting inflation under control, but it was still going on. Gold is also a very good hedge against crazy policy uncertainty,
yeah.
right? So there was also that. Now you've introduced the third element to this, which is gold is a better collateral, a safer collateral, because other assets that can be collateralized like land are one, too expensive, two, the transactions costs are too high and it's just too crazy,
Yeah.
right? Now I have a fourth element to add to this, and tell me if I'm anywhere close to, what you've observed. Does this also mean that there is a certain amount of, sort of women's empowerment and better sharing within the household? And what I mean by that is a lot of the gold is still held in jewelry,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which means this is really, is it women trying to stake a greater voice and say in how the wealth is both accumulated and saved and distributed within the household? And of course, it is available for collateral, so it's kind of wise.
Mm.
And part two of that is the downside of that, because we haven't included women in the equities market and the systematic financial economy,
Mm-hmm.
because either, we just like to not have any financial literacy and we generally make it very intimidating for women and we kind of poo-poo them when they show up. A lot of the women I know, even though they're educated, like, my mother's generation, they don't even like going to the bank.
Mm.
It's a bit much. The whole thing is a bit much for them, even though they're very competent, very well-educated women. So is that another element of what is playing out with this gold business?
To be honest, I haven't thought of it that way because I also probably don't have enough data. It's interesting that you say it. Like, for example, when a girl is married into a different household, she does carry gold with her. Now, certainly, it doesn't always stay that way. It does sometimes enter into and like as collateral. I haven't thought of it that way, Shruti. I don't have enough like knowledge of this one to kind of say that
Nor do
definitely.
I. This is
Yeah,
just a hunch.
yeah. Like at some point, I think we'll have to kind of look at uh, if they do have agency, they do have disproportionate agency over gold. You will want to see data in terms of gold loans to women, for instance. If what you're saying is specifically true, I'll probably want to then, and I could do that. I could try and look at gold loans to women. Are they increasing specifically? If so, then you know that a specific like this she has agency on this matter, has disproportionate agency, and that is reflected in her using gold to possibly try and use it for education or try and use it for a productive asset like a sewing machine. So I think we'll try and see that to really see if there is something there. But I'm not 100% sure yet. I don't have the
Yeah.
data point
So
to
I'll
kind
tell
of.
you the counter to that, right?
Yeah.
My counter to the point that I made is maybe they just buy it more in jewelry rather than, in gold bars or gold options or
Yeah.
something like that. Is it's harder to expropriate jewelry. I mean, it would be a public scandal if you make women take off their bangles and,
Yeah.
things like that. Like, it would just be unheard of.
Yeah.
So maybe that's the reason. Like, it's another layer of protection against all sorts of crazy. Plus, of course, if you can wear something beautiful and also have it as collateral,
Yeah.
it's a multiple level win. But that's what would be the counter to that argument. So this gold loan thing that you're talking about is super interesting. Another is, this is of course the older, generation. The way women used to use chit funds
Mm-hmm.
to save up and buy gold,
Mm.
which is a sachetization scheme if you really think about
Yeah.
it, right?
Yeah.
Same with, saris for Diwali, like all these big nalli and, all of them used to have like a chit fund version for the
Mm-hmm.
lower end of the market. You
Yeah.
put in small sums of money.
Yeah, my wife used to do this with Tanishq. They had a Titan. I think they had
Yeah,
one of these gold Tanishq it was. They had this thing where you go and put in X amount of money and that becomes a gold kind of saving and you get a certain like
exactly.
X amount of gold at the end of the day. And there are some interesting, there's a company called Jar, which is fascinating. They have this roundup thing where like, you spend 90 rupees and there's 10 rupees. You can round it off and you can set an algorithm that each time you pay like 163 or 173 rupees. 27 rupees gets rounded off and buys a gold, like a digital gold. It
Oh,
buys
how
digital
lovely.
gold. Yeah, yeah. So there's some interesting things and full credit to Joseph Sebastian, who's a colleague. And like I joked that like all Mallus he has an obsession with gold, but in this case, like land and gold is what he kind of identified. I know that land is an area of interest for you, and I think I think that's like on land, for instance. I also bring it later into there's a section
Yeah.
of the Indus
On
Valley.
land labor capital. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's another one on addressing, which is to do with why India has poor address and how much they cost. So I would say that if we can kind of just figure out, like the government just figures out addressing and mapping, like digitization, and says like like land that and says some scheme by which it goes down to like the like 9 square meters or something, right? Which is the size of a room or whatever, and says if we can kind of map India into that, and then that can be kind of that becomes like a common, like how UPI or Aadhaar became, it becomes very
Absolutely.
common thing. The amount of efficiencies and the amount of benefits, and everyone can build on top of it
Yeah, we'll just unleash.
automatically.
Yeah.
Yeah, reduces litigation
Yeah.
because a lot of litigation is around land, as we found out, and it's incredible. It'll improve addressing, will improve other benefits, like for example, collateralization will improve, like even logistics efficiency will improve, etc. I'm surprised. Yeah, yeah.
My solution to this is, I mean, we're already a very highly taxed society, but governments need incentives like anyone else, right? So why did we have better land records under Queen Victoria? It's
Hmm.
because she's the residual claimant and capturing that revenue from the land.
Yeah.
One of my favorite movies on this is The Englishman Who Went Up the Hill and Came Down the Mountain. It's this hilarious movie about, this small village somewhere in England where they think they have a mountain, but the geography surveyors, like geographers, actually show up and it's a few feet short. So the entire village, to maintain its pride and its mountain, will actually collect soil and dirt and raise the
Wow.
height of it. Yeah, it's charming, cute film.
Mm.
But once upon a time we had geographers and surveyors as a class of government workers, and their sole job was to survey, map, and of course a very large part of it was a little pernicious because it had to do with revenue.
Mm.
But if we start having property tax,
Yep.
right, and like the core basic simple things, now everyone wants to protect their property. One of the best ways to show that the property belongs to you versus someone else is if you have a long record of paying taxes,
Hmm.
and the municipality has an incentive to guard it,
Hmm.
right, if
Yeah.
they in fact can gain revenue out of it and actually funds them. So there is a Georgian way of threading this needle very well. We just refuse to do it. And now, we have drones we can use to map. I mean, there are so many things we can do, but we just refuse to map, survey, and title. And it's a bit depressing. You have
Yeah.
Karthik's book out, so now I'm scared.
Yeah. So, in fact, I wanted to quickly get the stat, but I don't think I'll find it because there is a very interesting passage where he talks about how India is undertaxed on the property front,
Yes,
and that is something that we've just not used. And I think he
absolutely.
also has the usual caveat saying we're anyway taxed and this one. So I'm just trying to find that
No,
particular
but we are
page,
very
but
regressive, because we are overtaxed on consumption. By definition, those taxes are regressive because poorer people spend a larger proportion of their income on
yes,
consumption than rich people.
yes,
So
yes,
if you want to have a truly equitable tax system, you want to truly be pro-poor, you got to actually tax property and, reduce taxes on consumption. But we've got it flipped exactly the other way, right?
yeah,
And we can't easily tax capital because in this globalized world, there's capital flight.
yeah.
So we just have to find saner ways of doing it. And somehow we only want to tax consumption and capital, which are the worst things to tax. So sometimes I just wish there was a little bit more economic literacy, right?
Yeah, you're right. So I would say that property, India is one of actually, for instance, US. It's not like I've studied the US super deeply or anything like that, but in the US, for instance, property is significant. Like, and for example, I've seen this movie called The House of Sand and Fog, where Jennifer Connelly loses her house
Yeah.
because she didn't pay,
Yeah.
forgot, I don't know, goes through some phase which she forgets and the house is possessed. So US is where when you pay property, but fundamentally I feel US is a country where there's a very strong local connection.
Yes.
Whereas India, Indian elite, barring a few who have lived in a particular place all their life, have no local connection or empathy. Like, for instance, I live in Noida and I live in the society, and I have no big interest or attachment to the places outside of it, right? I live sort of I like to kind of, it's sort of I live one level above all of our these things. And I think of myself as far more India. I never think of myself as,
Yeah.
oh, I'm sector. Whereas the US, for instance, they're very proud. Like they think of themselves as belonging to a particular locality, for
Yeah.
instance, right? And yeah.
But even the Noida example you gave, you actually bought into the fiscal federalism aspect, right? Because your society presumably provides all these basic public goods and,
Yeah.
water and electricity backup and basic security and, the garbage is picked up and all of that stuff. And that's really why you chose into that society, even more
Yeah.
than Noida.
Yeah.
Right? And what the US has managed to do is, it's managed to do that. In India, we managed to do that through gated communities because the private sector has filled in for this terrible, vacuum that local governance has left. But we just thought local government is not important or enough in India. In fact, we didn't want it because, when they were writing the constitution, they said all these villages are all like dens of parochialism and, all of that, right? So we need like a state level and a union level. We'll be like the Soviet Union, but the consequence of that is garbage doesn't get picked up and you don't have traffic police and
Yeah.
traffic lights are a suggestion. And in Noida, you have pizza delivery boys whose pizzas are stolen before they can deliver them. I actually read this in a paper. So it's all a little bit upside down. So, it just always keeps coming back to the same theme, right? So I guess, one important theme that I keep going back to every year I read your report is there are limits to what the Indus Valley can do without the scaffolding of a functional state.
Yeah.
In fact, they punch above their weight. They go above and beyond to solve a lot of public goods problems that technically are not the business of the private sector. But even past that point, there is not a glass ceiling, there's a concrete ceiling, and the state eventually has to do its job.
Yeah. So this cocooning, as I call it, like increasingly what's happened is you relying on the private sector to take over every single thing that would be solved through public goods. And when finally it's down to you can't solve for air, right? But if Delhi could solve that, and I'm just waiting for a new fancy building which has a glass cage and the entire thing inside will be kind of
I think
purified.
it's called Oberoi Hotel because they
Right?
keep advertising minute to
Yes.
minute what the
Yeah.
AQI is outside and what it is inside.
Yeah. Probably will have a glass enclosed dome, some kind of a dome in which people will grow up. So I think this also I feel, uh, when property, when you don't even know how much property tax you pay, it's very little, and there's no strong connection with the land. And when more and more services are being coopted by the private sector, I would say it's almost like Indians, when you're taxed, it also forces accountability from the government, right? I think I mentioned it last time as well, that more and more, I think the Indian state is fundamentally saying, like this time also, they just reduced the number of people who are going to pay tax. It's going to halve. Just
Yeah.
2% pay tax and income tax, and it's going
Yeah.
to come down to 1%, right? And a lot of the tax that we're paying is going into GST or corporate
Yeah.
tax, etc. The
Which
income
means we're
tax.
taxing the poor instead of the rich. It's a mortifying.
Yeah, yeah. So it's sort of India is a country. I think a good way to understand it is unique. It's different interest groups, and there is and some of these interest groups align. There's an India One interest group, and the India One interest group, because it consumes a lot of U.S. products, wants to keep the rupee dollar exchange rate towards itself, right? And that means there's a second order impact is on manufacturing, right? The ideal exchange rate actually should be something like 110 or I don't know, 100 maybe. I'm not the economist, macroeconomist, but actually the real effective exchange rate says that we, for example, overvalue. And the one luxury product India one loves is to send their kids to the US, right? And for that, they have to keep the dollar at a certain rate. And their interest groups like bureaucrats, which want to collect rent in terms of pensions, and they want to go back to a fixed. So different interest groups are extracting their rent and tax in India. And India is becoming a country where when you get the ability to do that, you will extract that rent.
Yeah.
And it's sort of sad that we're not sitting and solving out that. Farmers, for instance, they want free whatever. The second order effects of that are in pollution, right?
Yeah. Groundwater. Yeah.
Groundwater. Yeah.
So, I don't mind a certain minimum amount of rent seeking, and, that's just like the way of doing business. But you're absolutely right. Now, the kinds of things you're mentioning, it really threatens macro stability.
Yeah.
Right. And now
Yeah.
this is a public bad for everyone. It's not just a matter of a minor transfer that,
Yeah.
I took the subsidy away from leather apparel manufacturers and I gave it to,
Yeah.
textile manufacturers or something. Now this is much more systemic and there's like a much bigger thing that's actually going on. You make these amazing connections both in the report and otherwise because I've been reading you for a long time. Before we end, I want to ask you, how do you read? Because I think that might be an interesting thing to know for people. And I don't just mean books because, you read blogs and Substacks and you listen to so many podcasts. I have no clue how much time you have in a day
Yeah.
because you're like on top of all of it. And I know some of it, of course, is just a direct input into your daily work and writing the report and things like that. But how do you choose what you read and how do you kind of curate that for yourself? Because I think people would be very curious now that they are consuming what you are putting out.
All right. Thank you for that. Yeah. So, one change I did in my information consumption a few years back was to go into highly dense and sort of kind of joke, use this food metaphor for going into proteins, like, what are the equivalent of proteins and kind of reduce carbs, especially in the startup world. And I've discovered that podcasts have a disproportionate influence because it's very hard to kind of sit and create. Now, of course, AI makes it simpler, but there is a certain friction to creating content through writing. Now, how AI will change it will be very interesting. But podcast meant that a founder could come in and share his 3, 4, 5 interesting things. So I kind of over-index on podcasts a lot, and a lot of the insight, a lot of the interesting perspectives actually come from podcasts. That's one. The other one is I do consume a lot of reports, which are these equity research analysts, like these macro reports. The World Bank put out an interesting one on India, on etc. And I think over time, what's happened is really that you sort of, as you kind of read in a particular thing, you have a certain mental scaffolding, and then you kind of add stuff to that.
Yeah.
So that makes it easier and easier to consume. But I think these two are content formats that typically others don't over-index on, podcasts and research reports, equity, especially equity research reports, and try and take out interesting data points. Like, for instance, there was a very interesting one on air conditioner market. And from that, two interesting data points came out by Jeffries, or I forgot, I think it was Jeffries. And two interesting data points came out on how room air conditioner market consumption and like at what income level does it suddenly spike.
Yeah.
The other one was interesting one on how import bans led to
Yeah.
suddenly manufacturing growth in room air conditioners. So it's sort of keeping that curious this thing and trying to see if there are very interesting patterns, etc. So I think it's a lot to do with how I read. I mean, it's not so much. I would say some of it is that I read the same thing that others do, but I
I'm not
probably
so sure.
extract out. Yeah.
I don't know too many non-economists who are reading Karthik's book
Yeah.
with the kind of detail that you're reading it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Like, yeah, I'm sort of halfway through, but yeah, the 4 bookmarks, each for like, yeah. So it's a fascinating book, and I know you interviewed him, and I've kind of read the transcript of that as well.
That was like climbing a mountain, speed reading that book.
Yeah,
it was
yeah, I
like,
can
wow,
imagine.
this book is so big. And the research is just so good. So, you can't kind of
Yeah.
skim Karthik's work, right? Like, you have to really pay attention. So I was cursing him the whole time. I was cursing him through the recording of the podcast. I was like, Karthik, make
Yeah.
this easier for the regular mortals.
Yeah.
But you also read a lot of history,
Yeah.
I mean, you read. So is this coming from like your Times of India days? Like, where is this? I don't see too many people who are, VC investors or startup founders reading very much. I see all of them listening to podcasts though. So that,
Yeah.
I think that fits.
Yeah. I think I've always been an eclectic reader, and like, people typically they're reading science fiction or non-fiction, and non-fiction is really text fiction. I like to read diverse stuff. Like, so 3-4 months around the time I'm working on Indus Valley, the first 2 months are a little more slow burn, the last month heavy burn. I tend to pick up books like Lilliput Land and Accelerating India's Development and books like that. I read one by Raghuram Rajan and Rohit Lamba was interesting as well.
Oh yeah.
But I do find history fascinating. Last year I read India's Broken by Ashoka Modi, which is kind of gave a very interesting,
very pessimistic.
Very pessimistic. Yeah. So I think history is a particularly interesting thing. But I think Shruti, it finally is down to, I think over time I've read so much and so different things, and certainly unusual for a VC that there is a certain like I would say an intellectual scaffolding, and it's easier to absorb certain kinds of data and easier to kind of connect some piece of data. So I think that probably is the reason.
Like everything else, that also compounds, right? Which is amazing.
That is true.
So there's some advantage of being older.
Yeah, that's true.
But thank you for doing this, Sajith. So one thing I hope in the future is, in addition to the decks, you also write part of the report, because I love your writing. I've been reading it for a long time. So that'll also be very cool. Like, that short, like 4-pager, 5-pager of your insights, which always sound different when you write them versus when they're in a deck versus when you speak. So that would be lovely. But a huge congratulations to your team. This is it's a real public good. Everyone reads it. It's like become this point where everyone converges. So thank you for doing this, and thank you for coming back.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that. It was a pleasure. And I'll keep that in mind, what you said about writing, maybe like a 4-page or 5-page. I'll keep that in mind.
Thank you for doing this. Ideas of India is produced by the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Help us grow by giving us a rating and leaving a review. Follow us on Twitter at @SRajagopalan and at Ideas of India. Also check out our initiative commemorating 30 years of India's market reforms at the 1991project.com.